Recording in progress, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast. This time with a research fellow uh, introduced to me by Dr. Beatrice Villarol, we've had on the podcast before, PhD as well, Matthew Schultz. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll get into your specific areas of research and through as we go on the podcast. But I want to start with a question that I often ask the researchers and scientists they have on the podcast. I've had several on from NASA, for example, Dr. Villarol. The question I always start with, and this really does apply to Freemasonry as well, because in Freemasonry, we're encouraged to, part of our ritual is we're encouraged to take the time to study liberal arts and sciences, astronomy, geometry. We're encouraged to study and try within whatever time we have to engage in study and science, not necessarily quote unquote purely practical things, but things about astronomy, physics, geometry.
Sure.
So for yourself, the question I always start with is why study stars? Why study the skies? Why look up, especially when people will often point out, many of the problems down here on the earth. Why research, things that are millions or billions of light years away?
Well, the short answer in my case is too much Star Trek. There are two kinds of astronomers. And when you interviewed Beatrice, you interviewed what I call the type 1. Type 1 astronomers are really into math. Type 2 astronomers are really into science fiction. And since I've started, I have never met a single exception to that rule. They're either one or the other. And there's surprisingly little overlap between the two of them. You and Beatrice were talking about science fiction, and she was like, I don't really read it, not surprising at all. But for me, yeah, too much Star Trek. That's the short answer. The longer, maybe more interesting answer.
Well, before you do the longer answer, then I got to ask the question: Kirk Picard, who wins?
Geez. I mean, before the new show came out, I would have said Picard in a heartbeat. But they kind of ruined that character, so I'm going to go with Kirk.
Okay, Kirk. So one for Kirk. I've not seen the new. I grew up. I was born in '83. I never actually watched the original series. I was always a next gen guy for the longest.
No, I started watching Star Trek when I was like 3 years old. It was the original series, and then I got really into Next Generation when that came out. I was like 8 or 9, I think, when that started airing. Maybe younger. I forget the exact year that it came out, but. I tried rewatching from the beginning of season 1, Next Generation, when I was in my early 30s, and I couldn't do it. It was so terrible. But yeah, so why study the stars? Why do anything that is not of immediate practical utility? So there's a lot of possible answers there. One sort of, I guess, somewhat practical answer is that you might almost think of us as like the advanced scouts for humanity's future galactic empire. Before we start expanding out to the stars, we have to know what's out there. So that work will be useful in a few hundred years, hopefully. But another answer would be, why write poetry? Why paint paintings? Why make movies? So astronomy obviously has very few direct practical applications. Every once in a while there's a spin-off technology or something like that. But that's not really why we do it. We do it, it's a decorative science in a sense. We do it because we can. We do it for the same reason that, why do you climb a mountain? Because it's there, right? Why do we study the stars? Because it's cool, because there's neat stuff up there and we want to understand it. And I always get very kind of annoyed when people are like, oh, but there's problems here on Earth. It's like, yeah, there's always been problems here on Earth. And that's never stopped people from engaging in the kinds of activities that push civilization further, in terms of our ability to be human, I guess. If we just stripped everything down to like just pure utilitarian, only doing that which feeds us and houses us, then what would the purpose of civilization be, really? To my mind, the purpose of civilization, of all of that activity, all of that material activity, is precisely to support those kinds of, for lack of a better term, I guess, decorative arts.
Do you think that that is connected at all to like the critique of the problems here on Earth, or there's immediate problems? Do you think that that is connected at all to social media and the way, like, we're constantly inundated with the
Right.
problems of today and 24-hour news cycles and the emergency of the moments? I always like the expression, right? Never let the urgent push out the important, type of thing, right? It seems like with social media, the urgent is more and more urgent and more in our face, and it can be hard to take a few moments and think, a couple hundred years into the future, in a way that, you know stonemasons, it was regular 500-600 years ago to start a project that wouldn't be finished in your lifetime.
Yeah,
That
this has been one of my biggest critiques of modernity. You actually touched on a couple of my critiques of modernity right there. First, the social media effect, just the way that our minds have been warped by the algorithm. Uh, the social media news feeds, of course, are set up to show you more of what you like, or more of what gets a reaction from you, more to the point, right? More what gets engagement, because what they're looking at is not whether you enjoy it, but whether you engage with the platform. And it's designed to get you to engage as much as possible. What gets engagement? Outrage gets engagement. So, you see a video of a police officer beating someone up and it looks unjustified. That goes everywhere, right? And then the algorithm says, oh, people really engaged with this. Okay, well, we'll show them more of it. And then you get a feedback loop established. And that can be applied to sort of any kind of outrage thing. And then when that's all people are seeing on their social media feeds, they get kind of a warped idea of what the world is actually like, what humans are actually like, what society is actually like. So it's all just, there's sexual harassment everywhere, there's rape culture, there's racism hiding under every rock, there's police brutality everywhere, and just everything is really, really, really terrible. And that it just turns into this really terrible feedback loop, which is ripping society apart. And the other thing, of course, as you mentioned, that architects would plan projects that would take centuries sometimes to complete. You would start building something that wouldn't be completed until your grandchildren's time. And people naturally thought centuries in advance. When you built something, you built it to last. Because you built it to last, you wanted it to be beautiful. And then over time, your material environment fills up with buildings which are durable, which are really attractive buildings, which uplift the soul. And now we don't have that anymore. We don't look more than into the very immediate future, or even just telescope down to the immediate present. We build our buildings with the expectation that we're going to rip them down in 10 years' time. So we don't build them to be beautiful. We build them quite ugly. In fact, everything is cheap and disposable and tacky. You walk around your average city and you have just hideous architecture. And this, I think, has a corrosive impact on the human soul.
And then from the perspective of scientific research, and it's not really my area, but I'm assuming, like everything else, right, there needs to be funding and grants and you need the public on board, because that will help you get that will help research to get the necessary funding. Does that then, I guess I can see then the danger the danger in, or do you think it's a danger, or where's the balance you think for science to become uh, enjoyable and accessible, and something that, for lack of a better term, becomes clickbait, so that people, when they see it on the news feed, they click on that, versus,
Yeah.
I mean, and it's the same thing with Freemasonry. It's in a lot of, like, sometimes things are just, boring by necessity, in a sense, right? There's only so much interesting you can make, for Masonic meeting, for example. When people are talking about membership and attendance and getting people out, there's always the discussion about, like, well, do we need to pay the bills and read the minutes? And it's like, well, it's boring, but I don't know how to not do it. So from
It's
the
got to be
scientific
done. Yeah.
how do you find that balance between, the
That's
research and the public facing aspect of it?
that's a tricky one. I mean, so yeah, I mean, the funding model for science has gone through a few iterations historically, right? If you go back to the 19th century, then most science, and before that, anytime really before that, no, that's not true. If you go back right to the very beginning, so to Galileo's time, science was generally funded by patrons. So you'd have some rich guy, and he'd get some, smart academic, some artisan, and basically pay for him to do whatever he wanted, as long as every couple of years the guy like made like a nice sculpture of the patron or something like that, right? And that went for a while, and then by the time we get to the 19th century, it seems to have evolved into sort of gentlemen scientists, sort of like rich amateurs essentially, who were self-funded because they were independently wealthy. They didn't need to look for funding. They just did it because it was fun, and that was actually the period that we had some of our greatest scientific breakthroughs. And then in the 20th century, in particular in the post-war period, that's when you have the rise of the national funding agencies. So you have the birth of bureaucratic science, and that has its ups and its downs. So on the one hand, there's more funding available, which is good. On the other hand, you get to a point in your career, and rather than doing scientific research, you end up spending a substantial amount of your time writing grant applications. And this is becoming more and more of a problem these days, because the number of scientists is growing larger than the amount of money available from the granting agencies. So the success of any given grant application has gone down quite considerably. My understanding is I think it's down to like something 1 in 10 grants gets approved now. It used to be like kind of like 1 in 3. So you could write 10 grants over one a year, and it could be 10 years before you get a successful grant proposal, and then you don't have any money at that time. Now, personally, I'm kind of fortunate because all I need is a laptop, so I don't need a lot of money, and money to live on, right? Now, that you could also maybe see like a crowdfunding kind of thing, like a Patreon model for science, where you get like the public to, rather than indirectly through their tax dollars supporting scientific research, but supporting scientists that they think are cool, whose research they find interesting, kind of directly. But I don't know how well that would necessarily work in practice, because then you have a whole other set of incentives that kick in, right? You need your science now to be like cool and exciting and sexy in order to like capture the public's interest and get funding. And there's unfortunately a lot of science that is of necessity rather dull, and the actually watching a scientist work is not terribly exciting. We're not Indiana Jones, and a lot of what excites us is not what excites the public, right? So obvious example would be like, in astronomy, people find it an astronomer, and their immediate thought is that I go up to the telescope and I take these amazing, beautiful images like you would see from Hubble, right? And I don't do that at all. I look at spectra and things like that. So, when I get like a really amazing spectrum of a star that I've been wanting to get data for a while, I get really excited and like, this is so cool. And I can look at that spectrum. And just by looking at it, I can sort of build that in my head into a model of like what that star probably looks like. But this is not a skill that your average person is going to have. And then communicating that to the public and getting them interested, this is a tricky thing. And most of the things that are going to excite individual scientists are not things that are going to be so exciting to the public, right? So, and when I do public facing stuff, I don't typically talk about my own research. I usually pick an interesting topic like interstellar travel or the Fermi paradox or something like that. And I prepare a talk on that subject. And because it's intrinsically more interesting than talking about the finer points of the magnetospheres of hot stars.
Yeah, the division, which is not exactly it's not really so much a hard and fast division anymore. It's pretty fluid of public facing versus like the exoteric versus the esoteric sides of it. Feels like everything now is much more fluid than it was before, perhaps out of necessity. Certainly with Freemasonry, there's that kind of idea. But
Well, I mean, in a sense, everything that I do is quite public, right? So you can very easily look up, and this is for any scientist really, you can look up their bibliography, their publication record. And at least in the hard sciences, all of the papers are now made available for free sort of by default. So you can sort of download the PDF and read it and get an idea of like, what this person does. Now, whether you'll understand it, right?
Yeah, that's always
yeah.
It's the audience, for which something is intended.
Yes.
That's always
when you write a paper, you're writing for the very narrow audience of people in your subfield who are going to be sort of directly interested, right? So, it's usually the case that if another astronomer is telling me about their research at a high level of detail, I might get a little bit lost, and especially if they're from a very different subfield, like if they do extragalactic astronomy or something, they're studying quasars on the other side of the universe. I'm kind of like, okay, like I sort of know they exist, but it's not like something that I could speak to with any authority or understand like an actual paper on it. Not without some difficulty, at least. And this is part of the problem in academia in general, is this kind of increased fracturing between the disciplines, where even inside the same discipline, you can have all of these sub-disciplines that are increasingly have a hard time sort of communicating with each other.
Is that a consequence of what you talked about earlier, the grant application process? Because if there's only so many grants available versus scientists, it seems like one evolutionary strategy would be to find a greater and greater or smaller and smaller niche area that you can then you're more likely to get noticed in the grant application field to differentiate yourself from the other hundreds of applicants, I would assume.
Yeah, it's a factor for sure. There are other factors as well. So you've probably heard the phrase "publish or perish." So contemporary academics, under, especially in the American system, are under intense pressure to publish as often as possible and get as many citations as possible. And this was not always the case. So again, if you go back to like the 19th century, actually, I have been told that the advice that most scientists finishing their PhDs were given was to not spend your career doing your PhD over and over again, move into a different field, right? And you'd see guys back then who would jump fields completely. They go from like physics into biology, or like chemistry into sociology or whatever. They completely change fields, and that doesn't happen very much anymore, because you have that pressure to publish, and if you take the time to read up on a new discipline to the point where you can make a meaningful contribution, well, this will take years, right, to get to that level. And during those years, you're almost certainly not publishing anything worthwhile. And then, in the modern context, then, okay, you spent 3 years changing disciplines to do something interesting and maybe cool and novel and interdisciplinary, but your tenure committee doesn't care about that. They care about the fact that you don't have any publications for that 3 years. You've been lazy as far as they're concerned. What have you done for us lately, And so then as a result of that, yeah, you have this kind of, people tend to stay in the same thing that they did their PhDs in and just kind of get narrower and narrower, or not broaden out really. And this then just, I think through natural social dynamics, you have different disciplines start using their own internal jargons, which are somewhat opaque to outsiders, right? And they're not doing it on purpose. It just kind of naturally happens. But increasingly, it means that communication just isn't possible. I had an experience recently, and I was talking to other astronomers, but they were radio astronomers, and they used a term that I hadn't. It was clearly being used in a technical sense, but I'd never heard it before, so I had to ask for clarification. And then when they explained it to me, I was like, "Oh, in my field, we call it this." Exactly the same thing, right?
So, moving on to your field more specifically, you did mention it at the earlier in the interview, and I found some articles, which I'll throw up in the description.
Yeah.
The connection between, and based on, and by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, seems like your research has focused on the connection between magnetism and stars, which I did not know stars to be magnetic. So there you go. So,
well, yeah, most of them are. So, I mean, the sun has it. The sun was the first magnetic field ever discovered off the Earth, was the sun back in 1908. It's very magnetic, in fact. Well, on a global scale, the sun is not very magnetic. It's like 1 Gauss, which, to give you an idea, a fridge magnet is about 50 Gauss. Okay. But inside sunspots, you know what sunspots are?
I do not.
Okay, so you have these dark spots that kind of come and go on the surface of the sun, and we call them sunspots. We've known about these since, I mean, the Chinese were looking at them like a couple thousand years ago. But we discovered at the beginning of the 20th century that the center of a sunspot has a magnetic field of like 4,000 Gauss. So that's sort of getting up to sort of the level of the inside of an MRI. But these sunspots are not small objects. They could easily swallow the Earth, put it that way. So it's basically a giant magnet. And this is all a consequence of the fact that the sun is a plasma. So, the 3 basic states of matter: you have your solids, your liquids, your gases, right? You add heat and you go from one state to the next, right? You go to the 4th state, plasma. That's where you add enough heat that the electrons and the protons kind of split off from each other. And now you have a gas of charged particles, positively and negatively charged particles. And when you take a plasma and you disturb it in some fashion, you make it sort of swirl around, you will generate magnetic fields with that. That's basically what's going on with the Earth's magnetic field. You've got sort of charged particles in the middle of the Earth in the form of the liquid like molten nickel down there, and the Earth's rotation kind of disturbs it, causes it to slosh around, and that leads to the formation of what we call a dynamo. which then generates a magnetic field. Basically, like if you have moving conductors, you will get a magnetic field.
So how are you detecting these magnetic fields? Are you just shooting off a fridge magnet to the sun and seeing if it actually sticks? Because I've got several fridge magnets.
This
Should
this
one
this
be required for
this
this?
gets this gets into quantum mechanics. Um,
Well,
so
I'm to do your best.
I'll try to make it fairly simple. So how to put it? I don't know. I'm not sure how detailed to get here. Actually, I mean, the simplest answer is that there's a neat quantum mechanical effect that causes energy level transitions in atoms to split to higher and lower energies in the presence of a magnetic field. And the stronger the magnetic field, the more they split. And we basically look at the spectrum of a star, and if we see that splitting in the spectral lines, which correspond to the energy level transitions in the atoms that it's made of, then we can measure its magnetic field.
And uh, something you mentioned, and I do like to talk about it. I talked about it with Jason Rhodes, a research scientist with JPL. Near this, you mentioned at the start when we were discussing, why astronomy, why astrophysics, why look at the stars. You did mention that there is, one of there can be a practical benefit in terms of the technology used for astronomy, rockets, propulsion, all these type of things. They can and often do find practical benefits in our day-to-day lives. I mean,
Yeah,
Jason Rhodes talked about
that's the spin-off technology argument. Yeah, which I mean, it certainly happens because when you're operating because to do astronomy, we naturally have to operate at the very edge of what is technically possible, and we're always pushing that edge, right? So one spin-off technology that you probably know quite well is the camera in your phone or any other digital camera, right? So these use something called a CCD, charge coupled device. And I think that was originally developed in the military, like back in the 70s, but very quickly that technology was adopted by astronomy because it was way better than using photographic plates. And we pushed that very, very hard through the 1980s. And, then eventually it got adopted for the consumer market. And optics in general, I mean, astronomy has been pushing the forefront of optics development since like the 15th century, right? Before that, a lot of mathematical concepts and techniques and tools that are quite ubiquitous now were in fact originally developed for astronomy. So yeah, I mean, this is the spin-off technology argument, and it's a very good one.
So then I'm curious as for yourself and your research, what type of like nuts and bolts, like what's the practical technology you're using day to day to find and test these things? And
What I
I
use
feel
day to
like
day,
that would
my
probably
laptop.
be the funnest part of it. Just me.
What I use day to day, honestly, is my laptop. It's a lot of
Right.
writing code and such. Uh,
I mean,
but
are the images, are you, so when you're examining the spectra, are they coming from, um,
large telescopes typically. So most of my data tends to come from Hawaii, uh, and every once in a while from Chile. Um, and there's a few other smaller telescopes that I've used as well, but generally, very, very few astronomers these days actually go in person to observatories. It's, now that we have the internet, uh, and ever since the introduction of charge coupled devices, well, the telescope image that you're getting is just data, right? It goes straight from the optics of the telescope right onto a computer. Well, if it's data on a computer, then it's just data, so you can move it around anywhere on the internet quite easily. So you don't need to be there in person, in principle. And increasingly, over the last 10 years especially. It's been a big shift that's happened from sort of starting just before I began in astronomy and it's sort of accelerated since then. uh, it's all done by professional telescope technicians and personnel uh, who operate the telescopes. And then that's kind of a black box to a lot of the actual astronomers who then just like download the data and just like work with that directly. Um, so yeah. Uh, so I personally am not strongly involved in things like instrumentation design. That's more of an engineering discipline, honestly. Um, I do a lot more sort of data analysis, data visualization, things like that.
You did, speaking of things I assume you typed into your laptop, and I'm gonna pat myself on the shoulder a bit. We were talking offline. You did mention that my interview with Beatrice Fillerol,
Mhm.
we got talking about um, potential extraterrestrial life and all that
Right.
fun science
Yeah.
fiction jazz. And I did mention that my assumption would be my assumption is that the physics that we have on Earth are the same everywhere, relatively speaking, and so therefore, this probably puts some constraints on the type of life that can develop intelligently.
Absolutely.
So I was going to throw that out there because you said that's a good point. I even think I copied that, put it in a
No,
comment.
that was and given that you've emphasized a couple of times, especially in Beatrice's interview, that you don't know a lot about science. I was like, that's actually is a very astute point that you made. Um, so yes, physics is, as far as we can tell, the same everywhere in the universe, and we've gone looking for signs of variations in fundamental physical constants on the other side of the cosmos. We found nothing, right? As far as we can tell, it is the same everywhere, and the physical law has always been the same. So we can certainly make that assumption. And then, well, basic engineering principles arise directly out of physical constraints, right? So a really obvious example would be is streamlining in aquatic life, right? Which has so you have multiple forms of complex multicellular life, which sort of internally is quite differently constructed, but fish, ichthyosaurs in the age of the dinosaurs, and of course cetaceans in the contemporary age. So mammals, reptiles, and fish all basically look like fish, right? Because of that strong constraint placed on their environment. Similarly, bats, birds, insects all evolved wings. The wings work a little bit differently with insects and with birds because of the different scales. But birds and bats are much more similar to each other. Similarly, the eye has independently evolved multiple times. One obvious great example is cephalopods, like squid and octopi, right? They have a very similar construction to the mammalian eye. But our last common ancestors, so far back that eyes hadn't evolved yet. So this is a very complex organ that evolved the same way. Why? Because the fundamental principles of optics don't change, right? So there was a really interesting book that I read, and it was when I was a student at the European Southern Observatory, and they had this fantastic library of scientific books, principally about astronomy stuff. It was really comprehensive, and there was some weird stuff in there. And I can't remember the name of this one book, but it was really cool. Basically, the argument the guy was making was that these basic engineering constraints go down to a really fundamental level. And he even, in one chapter, he looked at the structure of DNA. And it turned out that, so you can imagine there could be a huge number of different sort of basic hereditary molecules that might exist that are not DNA, right? With DNA just being one example of that. But you want a couple of things out of your basic hereditary molecule. You want it to be um, relatively stable, so it's not mutating all the time. You want it to be robust against the mutations that do happen, so that if you have little point errors because like a cosmic ray hits your DNA strand and causes a little like point mutation in it, like the entire organism doesn't just die, right? And you also want it to be flexible enough that it can evolve over time. And it turns out when you sort of like look at sort of an array of sort of alternative chemical means of making sort of DNA analogs, DNA as we know it turns out to be it's almost impossible to do better, right? And evolution seems to again and again hone in on that, on sort of as close to the optimal solution as it can get from a given starting point. And given that optimal solutions are few and far between in parameter space, that means that generally speaking, if you have a similar set of constraints, things will probably evolve towards a very similar form. So people sometimes think like, oh, aliens, they could have like 4 heads and like 10 limbs and just be like these like weird looking bug things, right? If you look at the history of life on Earth, it was very quickly that organisms evolved to have 4 limbs. So the really primitive ones, like centipedes, right? They'll have like multiple limbs. But once the organism got beyond a certain size, efficiency starts mattering. Well, the most efficient way of moving around energy-wise is actually 2 limbs. It's like the minimum number of limbs you need to like move around if you're not like hopping, right? Like if you're gonna walk. And then 4 limbs is sort of generally better. Like if it isn't about energy efficiency, but you also want speed and agility, then you want 4 limbs. Okay, so it's probably going to be the case that most large complex animal life living on land is going to end up with 4 limbs. Well, if you have 4 limbs, then bipedalism is probably going to evolve multiple times in that biosphere, because that's a relatively easy change to make, and there are advantages in terms of energy efficiency. And well, if you have bipedalism evolving quite often with 4-limbed animals, it is probably going to be pretty common that a lot of them are going to have their 4 limbs turn into their manipulator organs if they are sort of tool using intelligence, right? And then, all sorts of other things. Eyes. You don't need 8 eyes. You need 2. I mean, 1 would be the bare minimum, but if you want depth perception, you need 2. If you're a predator animal, you're going to want depth perception. Depth perception, that's really important, which means you have 2 eyes in the front of your head. If you are a prey animal, you're going to have 2 eyes on the side of your head to have the maximum 360 field of view. More really isn't necessary. Why are the eyes close to the brain? Well, to minimize the space between the eye and the part of the body which is processing the information from the eye. So sure, I mean, I guess you could have like 8-foot long eye stalks. Maybe that would be useful for something. But in general, for most life forms, that would be inefficient and kind of a waste of resources, which means that it would be disfavored by evolution. And you can sort of do this again. And even the guy in this book, the guy even mentioned hemoglobin as being sort of like, there's almost no molecule which is better at binding to oxygen. And it just kind of goes and goes like that. So, when I was reading this book, I was like, man, this is pretty interesting. Because like normally we kind of think like, oh, Star Trek, like this idea of there being a bunch of humanoid aliens is just so absurd, but that might actually be not far from the truth.
I guess the question that leads to, at least in my mind, and I don't even know if there's an answer for this, is then to what extent is if the optimal engineering constraints leads to relatively human favors human or humanoid evolution in terms of intelligent species, does that then follow that we're likely to see similar cultural practices and cultural norms? Are they likely to have
Define
religion?
similar.
And is there a Masonic temple out there in Alpha Centauri somewhere that we could visit?
I guess define similar, right? Even just looking at human cultural forms, we're a pretty versatile species in that regard, and that's all with the same basic biological template. So when you get to that level, I think the cultural diversity of the universe is likely to be quite amazing. And like everything I just said about like engineering principles leading to like, possibly favoring humanoids as one of probably not the, but one of the optimal solutions for a tool using intelligence. Keep in mind that a lot of that is just kind of like the external form of it, right? Like a lot of the internal mechanics of it could be very easily. And it's the same way that like a fish and a dolphin on the inside are nothing alike, right?
All right. Well, this has been, like I said, I'm not the smartest, but I love having very smart people on the podcast to talk about this stuff. I guess my last question for you is, looking ahead, I'm not sure. I'm assuming yourself, like everybody else, right? Every other field, Freemasonry, we've all been affected by COVID-19. It's affected the way we've been able to do our work and things like that. As knock on wood, as vaccination rates are going up, and hopefully sooner or later, we put this behind us. Um, what's the plan on your end in terms of getting back into a routine? Is our confidence running up again? Like, what's it been like transitioning and doing your work over the last year and a half? And what do you think it's gonna be like over the next, say, year or so?
Speaking personally, I'm pretty comfortable with the solitary life, to be honest. So I was deeply annoyed that I wasn't able to do the things I would normally do. Go to the gym, for instance. That was annoying. So I just turned my apartment into a gym, and sort of continued on from there. Well, personally, for me, for the foreseeable future, I'm actually just going to be continuing living as exactly the same as I was over the last year and a half. For the simple reason that I intensely dislike wearing masks. And at present, to go back to the office, they're still requiring all of that stuff, vaccinated or not.
I mean, from uh, the scientific perspective, we saw, and I'm not sure if maybe you were doing this even before the pandemic. Freemasonry was very slow, I think, in this area, and the pandemic, there was a silver lining. It kind of forced us into, we finally started to do more virtual stuff, and I was able to connect with, I used to joke I spent all my time on Zoom, but I was able to connect with Masons in Los Angeles and
there have been
Washington State.
there have been advantages to that for sure. So for instance, when we have weekly seminars, for instance, as every academic department does, and those would be in person. So you typically are drawing from a pool of available speakers who are sort of within reasonable driving distance, we'll say, right? Well, once everything was virtual, it was like, why not invite someone over in Europe to give a talk, right? So like the pool of available speakers kind of increased quite a bit. So things like that are it maybe even a little bit better than they were before. Although, like in person has its advantages as well. I know, like, at a very personal level, we started my immediate family started having, because we're all spread all over the world, right? as I imagine many families are. And we started having like weekly family Zooms. Because we're all sitting at home, nothing to do, why not, right? And we've just been doing that every week since the very beginning, still doing it now. And that's actually been really great. It's brought us closer together. We're more part of each other's lives in like a way that before that we weren't. And so stuff like that. I mean, there's silver linings, of course, to things like that.
But yeah, I agree with you completely that uh, personal, you need both, right? Personal, I think, will always be better, but taking advantage of the virtual space, like brought up bringing in guest speakers from Europe and things like that, right? I don't think that's. If I can speak for myself, I don't see that going away even after this is done. I suspect we've gotten so
No,
used to it.
and
We'll
like
still be doing.
in fact, in that specific example, you know, the the uh, the department is just continuing doing virtual seminars. Kind of, even though things are kind of back in person, semi sort of, but everything is just like done sort of simultaneously, both now, virtual and in person. Um, he said it's a tool, right? And I think like any tool has appropriate and inappropriate uses. And one of the problems I find that our society often has is that when a new tool comes along, we get obsessed with it and we want to use it for everything, right? Like when like the automobile was widely available and Americans were just like, we're going to redesign our cities around cars. It's like cars all the time. Like just everything is about cars. And, now it's become kind of hell on earth as a result of that. Just like giant parking lots everywhere and freeways. And, it's a very alienating environment. Why? Because we overused a tool. We used it for things it was not appropriate for. And we're doing the same thing with information technology. It's meant to help you think and help you communicate. It's not meant to replace thought, and it's not meant to replace in-person communication. It's meant as a supplement to it. But I find we do tend to overuse these things, but that doesn't mean to abandon it. It means to find the appropriate use for it and use it for that, right? Like cell phones, great example. Most of us, myself included, have developed raging cell phone addictions over the last few years, and now there's a movement towards minimalist phones to sort of say, okay, what do we really need this technology for? Well, communication. That's basically it, right? So these phones are being made which are able to call people and send text messages. Maybe have like an app, use maps or something, because that is actually useful. But like no apps, no sort of like games, like nothing like that. Like it's meant to, rather than be this thing that addicts you, to be something that you use when you need to use it, and then you put it down and go do something else.
I agree completely uh, with all of that, but especially the idea of right being careful not to overuse a tool. Right, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right, making sure that you're using a tool
Exactly.
for its appropriate purpose, and not going beyond that. And with that, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I'll throw out standard thing you say, like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff on the podcast. On your neck of the woods, you mentioned earlier, your stuff is available. If people want to learn more about magnetic stars, um, where can they
There's
go? Where
very
do they
little out there, unfortunately, which is sort of pitched at the popular audience. So everything I've written on the subject is sort of like peer review papers and such. I keep thinking it would be interesting to do like a popular work, but I haven't actually done anything like that yet, and neither have any of my colleagues, as far as I know. Nor do I maintain a social media presence. So like, there's like literally like no one people can go, nowhere people can go to, like, they can send me an email if they want.
I'll throw at least the articles I found about your stuff in the description. From I think it was, I said 2015, before you were an actual PhD, when you were a PhD candidate. But yeah, I do very much appreciate you taking the time to be on the podcast, and I wish you best of luck finding more of these magnetic stars, because like I said, I'm not smart enough to understand a lot of it, but I think it's very, very cool, and I really think it's important. It's a Masonic principle, but I just think, like you said at the start, it's important that even whatever problems there may be down here, we keep looking up at the stars, because we don't want to forget what's out there. And like you said, with poetry, with whatever it is, it encourages us to try to expand our understanding of the universe, which is always a good thing. So thank you so much.
It's actually home. So, we think it's a different place from here, but here is just part of that. All we're doing is understanding where we actually live.